I've been in the hospital for a couple of weeks now, minor surgery and then recovery, nothing life-threatening, or at least that's what I thought. The worst part isn't the smell of antiseptic or the squeak of nurses' shoes against the linoleum. It's not even the constant feeling of vulnerability lying here, tethered to machines. It's this cat. It sounds stupid, right? The hospital has a black and white cat that wanders the hallways at night. I first saw it around a week ago, slipping silently between the beds in my ward. No one else seemed to notice it, which struck me as strange. Maybe it was the pain meds or the late hour, but the cat felt real, and not in a comforting way. It wasn't until later that I began to understand what was really happening. The first night I saw it, the cat slinked over to the bed across from me. Old guy, in for something serious. The cat leaped up onto his bed and curled up right on his chest, settled down and fell asleep. I remember thinking it was odd that the nurses didn't shoo it away, especially since he was hooked up to a bunch of monitors. But I was groggy, and I must have dozed off because by morning the old man had passed. The nurses and doctors went about it as if it was expected, as if it was just his time. It was only afterward, as I replayed the night in my head, that I remembered the cat. I tried to shake it off. It was probably just a coincidence, right? But the next night, the cat returned. There are 6 of us in this ward, all spread out in a row of beds, and the cat seemed to know exactly who it wanted. That night, it jumped onto the bed of the man, 2 spots down from me. Younger guy in his 40s, seemed pretty healthy in here for some stomach issue. But the cat curled up against his side, and I swear he reached over in his sleep and stroked it like he knew it was there. By morning, his bed was empty. 2 deaths in 2 days in the same ward. Both times the cat had been there, silent, curled up against them in the night. I kept telling myself it was crazy to think the cat had anything to do with it. But when the 3rd night came and I saw it padding into the ward, it went to the bed right next to mine. There was an old woman there, hooked up to oxygen, dozing fitfully. The cat sprang lightly onto her bed, making itself comfortable near her feet. The same routine. By morning she was gone. I was wide awake when they came to wheel her out, pretending to be asleep so no one would see the panic on my face. I watched her go, feeling a hollow ache inside, knowing the cat had been there all night and done nothing, just watched her go. I started asking the nurses about it the next day. They gave me sympathetic smiles, told me there wasn't any cat in the hospital. They laughed, tried to reassure me, saying it was common to see things when you're on painkillers, when you're here alone at night, surrounded by strangers. I could tell they didn't believe me, or maybe they did and just didn't want to talk about it. The next 2 nights, the cat claimed 2 more people. A middle-aged woman with a broken leg and an elderly man recovering from pneumonia. The cat had jumped onto their beds, and by morning both were gone. I watched as they wheeled their bodies out, feeling my pulse race, wishing I could just close my eyes and pretend this wasn't happening. But it was too real, and it was coming closer. That brings me to last night. I was lying there, sweating, and feeling like I was teetering on the edge of a cliff, when the cat padded in. It's almost silent, that cat. Its paws barely make a sound on the floor, just a soft shuffle as it moves between beds. This time it didn't look at anyone else, it came straight to me. I felt my heart skip. The cat's eyes were fixed on me as it leaped onto my bed, curling up beside my legs. Its fur was cold against my skin, like it had just come from outside. And I swear it was heavier than it looked, pressing down on me, pinning me in place. I lay there frozen, staring at the ceiling, feeling the steady rise and fall of the cat's breathing. I couldn't sleep all night. I lay there, feeling its weight, the soft brush of its fur, barely breathing myself. I watched the room grow darker as the hours passed. I can't keep my eyes open any longer. Most of the time, I'm hired by people who are genuinely afraid, and I want to respect that. But what happened at this hotel, room 214, I need to get it out somehow. I thought I'd be in and out, spend a night, take some notes, see if I could catch anything on my equipment, then sleep soundly in my own bed the next night. Instead, I don't know if I'll ever really sleep again. This place had an odd reputation, to put it lightly. An old boutique hotel, it lures in ghost hunters and horror enthusiasts. People pay a premium to stay in room 214, specifically for the experience. The room's history is grim. A few strange suicides, a handful of guests who complained of frightening apparitions, and more than one case of people experiencing personalized horrors. The rumor was that whatever haunted room 214 didn't just want to scare people, it wanted to know what scared you and show it to you in every possible way. To me, that sounded like a classic tourist gimmick. I'd spent years debunking stories like these, figured this would be no different. When I checked in, the hotel staff seemed almost uncomfortable seeing me. I was polite, shrugged off their vague warnings, signed the waiver and followed them to my room. When they showed me to the door, the woman who handed me the key held on to it for just a second too long. She looked sad, I think, like she knew something I didn't. The room was unremarkable. Queen-sized bed, outdated wallpaper, a small, dimly lit bathroom, cozy enough, but it was cold and I assumed the radiator wasn't working. Typical for an old place like this, I got my equipment set up, a camera facing the bed, an EMF detector on the nightstand, and a small voice recorder on the desk. I settled in, checked my readings and waited. Hours went by, nothing. The air was stale, but that was probably just poor ventilation. I stretched out on the bed, mindlessly scrolling through my phone, starting to feel a bit disappointed. By midnight, I'd even contemplated heading back down to the front desk and asking if they had anything stronger to drink, but then around 12:30 my EMF detector spiked, lighting up out of nowhere. I grabbed my camera, adjusted the settings and started recording. Just when I thought I'd caught something tangible, the lights in the room flickered and went out completely. The only thing illuminating the room was the dim red glow from my camera's recording light. I turned my flashlight on, sweeping it across the room, expecting to see, well, nothing, but the EMF was still going off, beeping steadily. And then I heard a faint scratching, not in the walls, but on the ceiling directly above me. I looked up and saw, just barely visible in the dark, a figure scrawling something in what looked like dust along the ceiling. Letters, scraping, each one slow. My chest tightened. I don't usually get spooked, but this was too close. It's hard to explain, but something about the words themselves filled me with a sense of dread. They read, "I know what you're hiding." Before I could react, a sudden chill pressed against the back of my neck, almost like an icy finger tracing my spine. I whipped around with my flashlight, but the room was empty. The silence was the worst part. My instincts told me to leave, but pride kept me there. I sat on the bed, breathing heavily, staring at the spot on the ceiling where the letters had been scratched, and that's when I realized I had no idea what they were talking about. I didn't have any big secrets, but the feeling was there. Awful feeling, like the room knew something about me I didn't even know myself. Then came the sound of water dripping. The bathroom faucet was turned off, yet I could still hear the drip, drip, drip echoing through the room. I got up to check, flashlight in hand, and swung the door open. The bathroom was pitch black. The mirror steamed over as if someone had just been in there. On the mirror, in foggy letters, was written, "Do you remember?" I wiped it away, heart pounding, but the words remained, as if burned into the glass. The EMF detector was silent now, but my camera, when I turned around, I saw it was pointed at me, almost like someone had physically rotated it. I hadn't touched it, and no one else was in the room. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I sat back on the bed, staring at the door, silently daring myself to leave, but part of me refused to move. The longer I sat there, the heavier the silence became. I've spent enough time in haunted places to know the feeling of being watched, but this felt like it was looking right into me, like it was staring straight through everything I thought I knew about myself. And that's when I heard the footsteps. They were slow, starting from the far end of the room and getting closer, but I saw nothing. Then, from nowhere, I heard a voice. It sounded like my own, whispering, "Why are you afraid?" over and over again, louder each time. It felt like the words were slithering around my head, coiling tight. When I finally mustered the courage to open my mouth and say something back, to challenge it or to prove to myself that I was still in control, the voice stopped. The silence was suffocating. I don't know what happened after that. I don't remember falling asleep or even moving. I just remember waking up in that same spot on the bed, the clock on the nightstand reading 3:33 a.m., and a feeling like something was pressing down on my chest, heavy and smothering. My heart was racing, and I couldn't shake the sensation that I hadn't actually been sleeping. The thing that stayed with me, though, was what I saw when I got up to leave. I turned to grab my bag, ready to get out of that room, when I noticed a piece of paper lying on the nightstand, just a single piece of paper, written in handwriting that looked disturbingly like my own. All it said was, "I know." I finally left room 214, leaving my equipment behind, leaving my pride behind. I told the receptionist I was checking out early and practically ran out of the lobby. As I was leaving, I glanced back at the hallway to room 214, and in the dim light I saw the door was slightly ajar before slamming shut. Our local night shift radio host, Doug, had the usual gig, requests, dedications, and the rare caller hoping to vent about their shift. I'd tuned into his show for years. Doug had this gruff, steady voice, a bit rough but warm, like he was the only one up with you when the rest of the city was asleep. People always joked about how lonely he must be, that his listeners were his only friends, but he never seemed to mind. One night I was listening like usual when he suddenly went quiet mid-sentence. Just a break, I thought. Technical issues. But then he came back sounding rattled, which was weird for Doug. He mentioned something about a prank call. It was brief, and he tried to laugh it off, but I could tell he was shaken. I kept listening, curiosity piqued. As he resumed the show, there was this odd tension. I could almost feel it through the airwaves. He started up a track, an old-school classic, but halfway through, the song cut out. Silence, then static. That's when I heard the thump, and then another one like something heavy falling in the studio. Doug didn't come back on right away. There was just a faint shuffling, maybe from his mic or something behind him. Then, without warning, the lights in the studio must have flickered because you could hear him fumbling and cursing under his breath as he scrambled to get the equipment back on. His voice came back on air, a forced calm as he apologized, said he was dealing with some technical difficulties. I figured he was getting a little frazzled at that point, probably trying to keep the show going despite the hiccups. But then the broadcast cut again. This time there was nothing but silence for what felt like forever. He started talking again. He sounded almost panicked as he tried to explain to his listeners what was happening, that the studio doors were locked, the lights kept flickering, and the equipment was shutting down on him. You could hear the edge of desperation creeping into his voice. And then he made a strange request, asking listeners if anyone nearby could call the station or come by, like he really needed someone there with him. The broadcast went silent again, and all of a sudden there was a high-pitched, almost inhuman screech. It was faint but distinct, and it made my skin crawl. The lights must have gone out completely in the studio because he kept saying he couldn't see anything, that he was in complete darkness. He was rattling off his location, begging for help, sounding almost hopeless. The sound of shuffling grew louder. Then there was a thud. You could hear Doug breathing hard, panicked, his voice trembling as he said he thought someone was in the studio with him. He must have thought it was a prank or maybe some unhinged fan who had snuck in. He kept asking whoever was there to cut it out, saying he didn't want any trouble. And then there was this long silence. After what felt like forever, Doug started shouting, pleading for whoever or whatever was with him to leave him alone. His voice echoed, and I remember him yelling something like, "You're not supposed to be here," followed by a chilling screech. I'll never forget the final moments. Doug was still shouting, his voice frantic. You could hear him pleading, gasping, then screaming. There were more thuds and scuffling, like he was being tossed around the room until suddenly it went completely silent. Then static, nothing but dead air. I sat there, staring at my radio, waiting for something, anything, to come back. I didn't want to believe it. He'd been there, talking to us just minutes before, and now, nothing. I kept listening, hoping it was some messed up prank, that he'd be back on any second laughing it off. But he never came back on air. The next morning, going off the news on TV, the police went to check on the station. Every door was locked from the inside. When they finally got in, there was no sign of him. No Doug, no sign of a struggle. Just his chair overturned and his headset lying in the middle of the floor. I moved into this apartment a month ago. It was cheaper than anything else in the area, with utilities included, and the landlord was practically gushing with excitement when I said I'd take it. She handed me the keys immediately, almost like she was relieved. The building is old, creaky, but it has its charm, and I figured I could handle a little noise here and there at first. I was just happy to be on my own. For the first week, things were normal. I was unpacking, arranging things, trying to make the place feel like mine, but little by little I started noticing odd things. It began with small items, a hairbrush on the other side of the bathroom counter, a cup I could have sworn I left in the sink now back in the cabinet, a drawer left open when I distinctly remember closing it. I chalked it up to absent-mindedness. Moving can be stressful, and I figured I was just forgetting where I put things. Then came the sounds. They were faint, almost like footsteps, but muffled, like someone shuffling their feet. I'd hear it late at night, usually when I was lying in bed just as I was about to fall asleep. The first time I thought it was just the old pipes or a neighbor moving around, but it always seemed to be coming from directly behind my bedroom wall, just beyond the plaster. A few days later, I woke up to find my favorite book on the floor across the room. Pages crumpled, spine bent. I know I had put it on my nightstand before bed, and once again the drawer was open. Again, I knew I had closed it. I locked the door before bed every night so no one could have gotten in, right? One evening, while I was sitting on the couch, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. A flicker of movement in the hallway, just a shadow slipping past the light from the living room. My heart started pounding and I grabbed my phone, ready to call someone, anyone, but after a few minutes of silence, I convinced myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light. But last week, things got worse. I was getting ready for bed when I heard the shuffling again, this time louder, like it was right behind the wall. I froze, listening closely. It didn't stop. There was a faint scratching sound, almost like nails dragging across a rough surface. My heart was racing and I could feel a prickle on the back of my neck. I pressed my ear to the wall and in that moment I heard it. Breathing, shallow and quick, I backed away from the wall, staring at it in horror, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. But the breathing continued, growing faster, more erratic. I ran out of the bedroom and slept on the couch that night, heart pounding, ears straining for any more sounds. Yesterday, I finally decided to check the basement. The landlord had given me a key, saying there was a storage area down there, but I'd never used it. Something in my gut told me I needed to go down there to see if there was any clue, something to explain the noises. The basement was dim, with a single flickering light bulb casting weird shadows on the walls. There were stacks of boxes, old furniture, and piles of discarded junk. I wandered around, trying to steady my nerves. That's when I noticed the small door at the far end of the basement, hidden behind an old mattress. It looked like it led to some kind of crawl space. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door and pulled it open. The smell hit me first, a musty, stale odor mixed with something metallic. I shone my flashlight inside and my heart nearly stopped. The space was cramped, barely tall enough to crouch, and scattered with blankets, empty cans, and bones. Small bones, like from a bird or a squirrel. But there were bigger ones too. I felt like I was going to be sick. Then I noticed the walls. They were covered with scratches, and in the dust I could see footprints leading from the crawl space back up the stairs towards the apartments, toward my apartment. I slammed the door shut, practically sprinted back up to my floor, and locked myself inside. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone to dial the landlord. When she finally picked up, I tried to tell her what I'd found, that someone had been living down there. She sighed, finally saying, "We thought he was gone, and I'm sorry you had to find out this way." Turns out he left his apartment to be homeless, but kept going back to live in the basement. Every time the landlord kicked him out, he would come back and make home down in that dark, dank basement. Night came and I went to bed. I was lying in bed trying to keep calm when I heard the vent directly above me creak, just a soft metallic shift. My stomach dropped. I lay there, holding my breath, praying it was just in my head. Then I saw eyes. His eyes. Just staring at me. I screamed. He shuffled away. "I'm in my car now. I don't know where I'm going. I just need to be as far away from that apartment as possible." So, a few weeks ago, my auntie gifted me an old, beautifully crafted vintage camera she'd found at an estate sale. She thought I'd appreciate it since I'm a photography student, and I was thrilled. The camera had this ornate metal casing, almost like it was handmade, and the lens was smooth as silk. It was a perfect nostalgic piece of equipment, and I immediately started using it. On my first roll, I went out and took photos around my favorite spots, the park, an old bookstore, even some abandoned buildings. I developed the film. In each photo, there was a dark smudge in the background. It looked like a person, though blurry and out of focus. I thought maybe it was a defect on the lens or some light leak in the film, but then I noticed the details. This smudge was shaped like a man, standing just far enough in the background to seem like part of the environment. In the next set of photos, though, he was unmistakably closer. No matter where I shot, he was there, always a little clearer, always a little closer. The last photo of that roll was a shot of my reflection in a store window, but there behind me was this figure. No longer a smudge, but a dark silhouette, clear enough that I could make out a vague shape, like he was wearing a long coat. He just a few feet behind me. I hadn't seen anyone near me when I took the picture, but there he was, almost like he'd been waiting. After that, things went downhill fast. The next few nights I started feeling like I was being watched. At first I brushed it off, chalking it up to my imagination running wild. But it wasn't just a feeling. I'd catch glimpses of something in the corner of my eye, a shadow shifting, a faint movement near the edge of the hallway. One night I was lying in bed when I heard footsteps just outside my room. Soft steps, as if someone was pacing right outside my door. I froze, barely breathing, but nothing happened. The footsteps just stopped. In the morning I found my door slightly ajar, though I knew I'd locked it the night before. Then, one night, I woke up and saw him. Right outside my window, framed by the streetlight, was the figure from my photos. He was standing perfectly still, his face just out of sight, but I could see enough to know it was him. Somehow the figure from the photos had come to life. Or maybe he'd always been there and I'd just drawn him closer. Panicked, I grabbed the camera, as if somehow it was responsible for all of this. I thought about throwing it out, smashing it, anything to get rid of it, but something in me hesitated. It was almost like the camera was connected to him somehow, like it had been his way into my life. Desperate, I took one last photo, pointing the lens right at him through the glass. The flash went off, blinding me for a second, and when I looked again, he was gone. Relieved, I thought maybe it had worked. But when I developed that last shot, I saw something I wish I hadn't. In the picture, he was closer than ever, so close. I could see the details of his face, or what should have been a face, but it was blank. Just a pale, empty space where eyes and a mouth should be. And yet, staring into that blankness, I could almost feel his gaze, as if he were looking right through the photo, through the camera, straight at me. Last night he came inside. I don't know how, but I heard him moving around my apartment, the quiet shuffling of feet. I turned every light on, but no matter where I went, I could feel him following. At one point, I felt a brush of air against my neck, and that was enough to send me running. I fled to the bathroom, locking myself inside, but even then, I could hear the footsteps just outside the door, pacing, waiting. I'm posting this from my bathroom and the door handle is rattling. I don't know why we thought it would be fun, maybe because it was late October and everyone wanted a good scare. There's this old story around town about a dried-up well on the outskirts, deep in the woods. Supposedly, it's cursed, trapping the souls of people who met violent or tragic ends, keeping their screams echoing at the bottom. People say if you lean in just right, you can hear them. It sounded ridiculous, but for a group of bored teenagers, it was perfect. We set out around sunset. The well was off the main trail, hidden in a clearing surrounded by dense trees and thick dry grass. The well itself was old, made of weathered stones piled unevenly. Ivy had grown all around it, almost hiding the opening. Peering down, we couldn't see the bottom. It was just pitch black. One by one, we took turns leaning over, listening. My friend Sarah went first. She leaned her head over the edge, staying silent for a while. Then she jolted back, eyes wide, saying she heard screams. We laughed, sure she was just playing it up. But as each of us took turns, the reactions were the same. Everyone heard something different. Some claimed they heard whispers, others distant sobs or desperate cries for help. When it was my turn, I leaned in and everything else seemed to fall away. The world went silent, and for a moment it was just me and the darkness below. Then, faintly, I heard a low, wavering scream. It sounded raw, as if someone was stuck down there. I pulled back, heart racing, and tried to laugh it off, but something about it got under my skin. We decided we'd had enough and wanted to leave. That's when we realized Justin was missing. He'd been the last to listen at the well, and none of us saw him wander off. We split up, calling his name, searching the clearing and the woods surrounding it. But the night was closing in fast and there was no sign of him. Someone suggested he was pranking us, that he'd probably run ahead on the trail back to town. So we all made our way out of the woods, expecting to find him waiting to laugh at us. But he wasn't there. We waited for hours, but nothing. Finally, we decided to go to the police, hoping he'd just show up on his own. 2 days passed without a word. By then, the whole town was buzzing. Search parties went out and flyers went up everywhere, but it was like Justin had just vanished. Then a few of us, those who were there that night, decided to go back to the well. We thought maybe we missed something. Maybe he'd wandered off and gotten lost nearby. I don't know what we were expecting, but There was this hope that maybe we'd find a clue, or I don't know, maybe just feel closer to him somehow. When we got to the well, everything was silent. The woods were dead still, not a single sound except our breathing. One by one, we leaned in like we had before, listening. This time I was the first to hear it, and my blood went cold. Mixed in with the other cries and whispers, I heard Justin. His voice was faint, echoing from deep below, but I recognized it immediately. Begging, screaming, desperate. It was him, trapped somewhere beyond reach. We backed away from the well, stumbling, terrified, and ran. No one said a word to each other on the way back. We tried telling people what we heard, but no one else heard the screams. The well was searched and it was empty. The searches stopped, people moved on, but those of us who were there, who heard him, we know he's trapped in that well. After my divorce, I decided to move somewhere small and quiet for a fresh start. I found a cute little house in a rural town, just a one-story with a decent yard and plenty of room for my son Jamie to play. He adjusted well enough, made friends at school, but he also mentioned a new friend at home named Mr. Gray. I didn't think too much of it. Lots of kids have imaginary friends, especially during big changes. Mr. Gray became a regular topic of conversation. Jamie would tell me how Mr. Gray liked to watch over the house and keep him company. He described him as tall, with long arms, and wearing all grey. Sometimes Jamie would leave out snacks or little toys for Mr. Gray, and in the mornings they'd be gone. I'd assumed Jamie was moving them, but I still found it creepy. Then I started finding things around the house I hadn't bought, small toys, stuffed animals, even a couple of worn books with the covers torn. One night I found a tiny silver ring on Jamie's dresser that wasn't his. When I asked where it came from, he just shrugged and said Mr. Gray left it as a gift. By then, Jamie's descriptions of Mr. Gray had become more specific. He told me Mr. Gray had strange eyes that looked all the way around the room. He even pointed out places in the house where Mr. Gray liked to sit and watch, and I swear sometimes I'd feel a prickling on my neck if I walked past those spots. One night, everything changed. I woke up to the sound of Jamie giggling in the living room. I checked the clock. It was just after 2 a.m. I threw on my robe and went to see what was going on, assuming he'd snuck out of bed to play. But when I stepped into the hall, my skin went cold. There was a low, murmuring voice mixed in with his laughter. Someone was whispering to him. I crept down the hallway and peeked into the living room. I saw Jamie sitting on the floor with his toys scattered around him, and beside him, a figure. He was thin, with clothes that looked tattered, almost blending into the shadows. His head was turned down, focused on the toy in his hand, but I could see the pale stretch of his face in the dim light. There was something horribly familiar about him, almost like he'd been hiding there all along, and then his head turned toward me. I stumbled back, heart racing, and turned to grab Jamie, but when I looked again, the figure was gone. Jamie just sat there looking up at me, his expression innocent and confused, like nothing had happened. He asked why I was so upset, why I'd come into the room while Mr. Gray was playing. I called the police, but they found nothing. No sign of a break-in, no fingerprints, nothing disturbed. It was like he'd never been there. I have since changed the locks. In the weeks that followed, things only got worse. Jamie kept saying Mr. Gray was waiting and that he wanted to play more. He'd mentioned Mr. Gray's voice at night calling to him from outside his window. And the strangest part was the gifts. They kept appearing, random, odd objects I hadn't seen before, always on Jamie's dresser or tucked into his toys. Last night was the final straw. I woke up again to Jamie's laughter, but this time it was coming from just outside my bedroom door. I tried to move, but something in me froze. Paralyzed, like I knew if I opened that door, he'd be there, waiting. I sat there, listening, and I could hear that low voice again, speaking to Jamie, telling him things I couldn't make out. I stayed up the rest of the night, listening to the creaking floors and whispers. I'm moving us out as soon as I can, leaving this town and never looking back.